Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Food Fraud Prevention, an update, and what does a good strategy look like? My name's Amy Wayne. I'm a part of the marketing team here at Perry Johnson Registrar's Food Safety, Inc. And today we are very excited to be hosting Dr. John Spink from Michigan State University, and I'll be introducing him to you all a little bit later in the presentation. Before we get started, I want to cover a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees on the call are on mute to ensure call clarity, but we do absolutely want to take your questions. So please use the questions tab near the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel to type in and submit your questions. And you can do this as you think of them. You don't have to wait until the end. So please, as you think of your questions, just drop them right in there. We'll hold off on responding to the questions we get until the end of the presentation during our Q&A portion, but please feel free to submit the questions throughout. The biggest question that we usually get is regarding the availability of slides from the presentation or a recording. And yes, we will have those both available after the webinar is over from our website at www.pjrfsi.com. The recording will be available also from our YouTube channel, which we do recommend that you subscribe to if you'd like. You can just go to youtube.com and search for PJRFSI or Perry Johnson Registrar's Food Safety. Our channel should be pretty easy to find. All right, and this is just showing the where you can find the question tab on that GoToWebinar control panel that you should see on your screen. All right, and just to get us started, I wanted to launch a quick polling question, and that first question is your organization currently certified to a GFSI standard? Let me launch this polling question. And your options to respond are yes, we're certified with PJRFSI, yes, we're certified with another CB, no, we're not yet certified, but we're looking to become certified, or maybe you're not interested in becoming certified, you just want to learn more about food fraud in general today. We have a couple more of these questions throughout the presentation, just to gauge what's going on with the audience to help figure out how we can better inform you and how we can tailor the presentation to your interests. So I'll leave this open for a few more seconds as we get some responses in from the audience. And thank you again all for taking the time to be here today. We're very excited to be hosting Dr. Spink, as I mentioned. And we'll give this a few more seconds. We've got about 60% responding. If we can get a couple more votes in, that would be great. All right, let's close that off. And it's great. It looks like most of the people on the call today are certified, and we're super glad to hear that you're all taking that responsible step to certify your processes and your organization. All right, and now as we're moving on from that poll question, I would love to introduce to you Paul Demarin, our first speaker. He is the SVP of Food Safety and Supply Chain here at PJRFSI. Paul joined us just back in January, but he's already taking huge steps to help us improve, and we are very happy to have him on the call today. Paul has over 35 years of experience in the hospitality, service, and retail agri-food sectors. Before he came to join PJRFSI, he worked for 15 years in the certification industry and had clients in pretty much every sector, from food safety and supply chain to brand protection and quality. Paul has worked for many years in management system certification as well, and before that he was a professional chef and a consultant for over 20 years in major hotel chains, restaurants, private golf courses, and food service organizations. So without further ado, let me hand things over to Paul, and Paul, you can take it away.
Great, thank you very much, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. I certainly appreciate that. Welcome to the webinar, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. We certainly appreciate your time today. Just before we begin our presentation, certainly today we're in a game-changing, environment. We're all facing this, global pandemic. But over here at PJRFSI, we're fully committed to the well-being of our staff, our customers, our community. We've really seen the effects of COVID-19, not only in the USA and Canada, but around the world. During this time, we've had the pleasure and opportunity to see the best in each other as well, with our colleagues and our customers. We see it every day in doctors, nurses, the first responders, the people who are out there on the line and are directly affected by the situation. So on behalf of our company, I want to thank all of those people, as well as everyone on the call here today, for doing your part to help get us through these unprecedented times. As Amy mentioned, My name is Paul. I'm the SVP for Perry Johnson Registrar Food Safety Incorporated, or PJRFSI. I'll just refer to us today as FSI to make things a little quicker. Today I'm going to give you a very short overview of our family of companies and give you a bit of an idea in terms of our capabilities and reach. I also have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. John Spink, who's a director for Food Fraud Initiative and an assistant professor of supply chain management at Michigan State University. So thank you very much, John, for joining us. And I know I speak on behalf of everyone when we're really looking forward to your presentation. So let's jump right in. Perry Johnson Registrars, or PJR, we were originally founded by Perry L. Johnson, and this is in '94. And we've really been at the forefront of international certification and registration from the very beginning. After, in the beginning, achieving the ANAB accreditation, shortly after our creation in '95, our first venture into international business came in 1999 with an expansion into Japanese and Brazilian markets. PGLA is our laboratory accreditation business, who was also founded in '99. And then in the early 20s, we continued to see overseas growth in Germany, Spain, Canada, Portugal, Latin America, etc. During that time, we also attained UCAS accreditation, in more recent years has continued building our international expansion in the United Kingdom and China. In 2005, Perry Johnson and Associates was founded, and that's our healthcare technology company that specializes in transcription, medical coding, telemedicine, and virtual scribing services. Shortly after that, PJRFSI was born as a result of the demand in the industry for third-party certification to many of the food safety and quality programs that we know today. We're based in and headquartered in Troy, Michigan, but we're truly a global company, part of a family of companies really in the registration, testing, and certification areas. And although we have global offices around the world, we have a wide range of certification and inspection offerings, from HACCP to GFSI, gluten-free to cannabis and hemp, social responsibility to border security and FDA. So we certainly have quite a range of services and solutions that we can support you with. So now moving forward, we've really been, in the last 8 years, working with companies across virtually every sector in the industry. Processing, distribution, retailers, farms, importers and exporters, distribution companies. And we do so to help them manage their food safety, supply chain, quality, and brand protection risks. We're recognized as the #1 registrar in the Americas by the International Association of Accredited Registrars. And we do believe that there's a big difference between customer service and focus. And we're dedicated to uphold the highest standards of our professionalism, technical competence, and integrity throughout the life cycle of your audit process. And as Perry Johnson himself did over 30 years ago, in FSI Group, we apply the principles of quality management, collaboration, organizational excellence, really, in all of our office and field activities to ensure that we're complying with the requirements that are set forth by international standards organizations, accreditation bodies, scheme owners, and other concerned parties. We have over 460 auditors in the food world in 60 countries who not only understand the regulations of those countries, but also the language and, equally important, the culture of those countries. I'm happy to report as well that in the last 5 years, we've received a 9.5 out of 10 for customer service, which we're very proud of. So talking a little bit about our services, as the slide points out, certification industry has been deemed an essential service. But why? Really, because food safety certification is based on results of tests, inspections, audits, and it really gives confidence to you and me as a consumer because an organization's products or systems are being thoroughly evaluated against national and international standards by a competent third party. Now, it's not business as usual today, far from it actually. We've had to make a lot of changes in our business of how we're going to run to ensure that we provide high quality service while maintaining the safety of you, our customer, and doing our part to reduce the impact of COVID-19. We're not taking this lightly, and we've really used every precaution in our business today. The goal here is to reduce or eliminate direct physical interaction that could promote the transmission of the virus. We follow all of the recommendations by groups like the CDC and the FDA. And in today's market, this is even more critical. You know, the landscape of our industry is changing every single day. It's a dynamic place where trends are shifting, customer expectations are changing in an instant. So from recalls to regulation, navigating that landscape can be a real challenge for any organization, regardless of scope or size. We define our services into 4 key areas: auditing and certification to third-party accredited standards, like all of the GFSI schemes. We do second-party auditing, which are all of the standards that we as a certification body have written and developed. We do customer-specific assessments to manage the risk within your supply chain or your sites, and we offer training as well to all of the standards that we audit for. So now, just talking a little bit about the food side of the house, you know, right now we have over 30 programs that we currently support. There's many types of audits in the industry, as you know. Some are accredited, some are unaccredited, some are client-specific, some government regulated, others are retailer mandated. So as I previously mentioned, we work in almost every sector that there is, and we categorize those offerings into really 5 offerings that you see here. First party are generally customer specific audit criteria that the corporate entity or the specifier owns, generally, usually because of you know, reasons like technical knowledge or location of our auditors, language requirements, minimizing cost. These are all typical reasons that our clients would utilize us as a third party to conduct these audits. For our second party standards, again, we've written and developed these. We have a whole slew of them. Good manufacturing practices, GDP, HACCP, cannabis and hemp. And in fact, last week, our cannabis and hemp standards have been formally accredited by ANAB, and we're the first certification body in the world to have these. So we're very excited about that. Usually companies will choose our second party because they've been technically vetted and essentially they're audit ready. Third party, as I mentioned, are all of our GFSI standards or accredited schemes like ISO. And then finally, FSI is recognized as an accredited body to perform various government audits and inspections like FSMA, FSVP, or Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, or VQIP. And if you take a look at the non-food side of the house, really where it all started, this is just a sample of some of the standards that really started it all under management systems. We conduct accredited audits across many areas like quality, environmental, automotive, aerospace, many more. And if you think about it, food safety certifications, although over 10 years old now, is really still in its infancy when you compare them to the standards that you see here. Many years ago, there was a dramatic shift from individual system audits to combined audits and then integrated audits, where a company would have one integrated management system that would cover all areas of the business, such as an integrated QH&S program. That's standard practice today in the management system side, not so much on the food space side. However, we have seen a lot of combination audits or bolt-on audits, they're sometimes referred to, but from a truly integrated perspective, we're not quite there yet, but we'll get there. So now moving on to the accreditations, we have a long-standing relationship with many of these groups recognized around the world. You know, accreditation gives customers assurance that our family of companies operates under the rules of accreditation bodies and scheme owners, and that helps to regulate us as a certification body. Many times, like we've done, you know, even in the last month, we've partnered with many of these groups to deliver complimentary webinars for you, because, you know, we want to make sure that we're passing along the information that we get on a regular basis to make sure that you are fully informed. So when you look at these groups, typically where we as a certification body come and audit you to a given standard, the accreditation bodies and scheme owners come and audit us. It's a significant investment every year, but it's well worth it because it gives, again, you confidence that you partnered with a recognized and respected partner like PJR. So just switching gears here a little bit on COVID, you know, to address the pandemic, We've implemented many global procedures and processes when it comes to protecting our clients and our staff and even our communities. Many of our clients have contacted us indicating a variety of situations that could impact their ability to host a successful audit. Their operations could be reduced or even completely shut down. Others we've heard are no visitor policies. There's restriction on access to some locations while others are still open. So, I mean, there's several things that we are having to manage on a daily basis. When you take a look at GFSI, they have implemented temporary policies and measures as a result of COVID-19 and the global pandemic. It's actually in the scheme document. And currently, GFSI is allowing the certificate extension for GFSI benchmark schemes, and they'll give you up to 6 months to extend your certificate if your audit date happened anywhere between, you know, the April timeframe and moving forward. However, to do that or qualify, whether it's with us as your CB or another CB, you will have to go through a mandatory risk assessment. That is generally probably a 1 to 2 hour interview where this will be done via phone call just to make sure that we've covered off all the bases with you. Once that's done, then we can extend your certificate. So now, if you take a look at the last couple of months, I mentioned we fielded many countless inquiries from our clients about the different policies that we have in place. You know, we're really going through a lot of change right now. There's a lot of uncertainty that we're all facing. And certainly on a daily basis, we're reviewing the valuable public health information that we're getting from the CDC and other groups to provide you with the most up-to-date information. On top of the basics like staying home if you're sick, sanitizing everything from your car to your laptop and your hands, to developing clear policies, we're doing everything we can to make sure that our employees are sticking to these guidelines that we've put in place to protect our clients. We even have required that all of our auditors who work for FSI continue to self-monitor daily for COVID-19 and self-isolate if they believe that they have come into contact with anyone that may have been affected. Even if we all follow the recommendations and procedures by groups like the CDC, it still does not prevent us from getting this virus. So just be careful out there, everyone. Moving forward, I won't touch on this too long, but basically, in order to conduct a virtual audit and assessment, we need to have adequate connectivity and voice and video capability so that we can do that. We use many different technologies to, you know, document, record, review all of your processes and procedures and conduct live interviews. We have secure sharing platforms that we would conduct this and transfer documentation. I can tell you that as a company, we've probably already completed over 400 virtual audits. So we're becoming experts at this as we go along. So if you do want to discuss this any further, then please do reach out to me. And just in closing, you know, again, thank you so much for your time here today. We have over 30 years of expertise. We're recognized as #1 by the IAAR, and I believe that we would bring a real service to your organization to add significant value, greater transparency, hopefully cost effectiveness and risk management. We're continually publishing daily content and information that you can use to help protect yourself as a company. We work closely with our clients to make sure your needs and expectations are met. And lastly, you know, this is a time of great change. I believe our industry will be changed forevermore because this is really just a few short months ago that it happened. And we're really at the beginning of this. So, you know, I think that we all need to start building our plans for recovery post-COVID-19. That includes, in many cases, a pivot to your business models, your operations, your supplier policies, maybe even offboarding strategies, the various technologies, and remobilizing your workforce. So this is a time of monumental change, and really now is the time for us all to execute and lay out your plans to give not only your customers or suppliers, but your stakeholders and employees confidence that we're in control. So at this point, thank you so much for listening to me. I hope it was of value, and I'm going to pass it back to Amy.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. And it's that time again, so let me go ahead and launch our second polling question. And this is just to help John get started with his portion of the presentation. The question is, how confident are you that you're fully compliant with GFSI and FSMA / Food and Drug Cosmetic Act requirement for food food fraud prevention, excuse me. Please rate it on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not confident at all, and 5 being very confident. So while people are voting, let me just say again, in case anyone was late, if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them right into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll be answering those at the end of the presentation today. If you're looking for slides or a recording, since if you missed the beginning, those will be available from the PJRFSI website and our YouTube channel after the broadcast. So we've got about 50% responding, so let me go ahead and close it down. Let's see, we all seem to be at least fairly confident, I would say. It looks like a couple are still a little bit unsure, but hopefully John has some input for you guys that might be helpful. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce Dr. John Spink. He's the director of the Food Fraud Initiative and an assistant professor in supply chain management at the Business College at Michigan State University. Since 2013, John has been the director of the Food Fraud Initiative. His early research and industry engagement supported the foundation of the food fraud prevention, including as a member of the GFSI food fraud think tank that developed the first compliance requirements, and also as the lead author on the article Defining the Public Health Threat of Food Fraud, which is in fact the most widely cited definition of the term. Also, the Food Fraud Prevention MOOC, which is a free, massive online open course, is one of the most common training resources used for the covering of food fraud. So let me, without further ado, hand it over to John. And John, you can go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you. Just as a quick sound check, everything sound okay for me?
Yeah, you sound great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, everybody, thank you for being here, and really thankful for the continuing engagement and activity with PJR. It's been a great relationship over the years. Learned a lot about a lot of different industries as well. You know, a lot of us focus on food safety. It's really been fascinating to look at the big picture and see what's happening elsewhere and figure out what we can bring in. So overall, this is me, John Spink. So food fraud is my research topic. My wife might say that I study it every day, all day, but that's a real key from this, is that from the very beginning, having an immersion in just this, and looking really at the policy and strategy at the very base, trying to figure out what it is and then how do we address it. Something that's really significant for me is that over the last 10 years, I've moved around MSU quite a bit as I've followed the research. And most recently, since last fall, I'm now in the business college, and that's a big deal to transfer into a business college, and then also specifically supply chain management. And so I came in to really focus on the basic classes to look at the fundamentals of supply chain management, and then specifically to see where something like product fraud or supply chain risks or disruptions fit into the bigger picture. It's been fascinating. And what we've really seen is this shift from specific, very scientific, narrow focus activities that are really important, such as authentication, but really shifting to these becoming just standard operating procedures at the highest levels. So you think about things like quality management. That wasn't always in place. At some point, there was a novel approach to specific problems, and that's what we see with food fraud. So it's been fascinating and important to shift over to the supply chain management focus. So to move forward, first off, food fraud prevention research are resources. So what we do is this concept of outreach, research, and education. And me talking to you is outreach. I learn a lot of questions. That goes back to our research and into our education. A couple ways that you can interact in what we do is publish, and it's all about it. It's all about the ideas. We don't sell any products or services or collect information. And the first key is overall textbook. So this is 700 plus pages. It's got everything in it. I'd say it's really a great desk reference. So if you're working on food fraud prevention, you've got questions about the basic concepts or really applied applications, then this is a great place to start. Then also education is our free open online courses. The content's always free. There's a fee for a certificate of completion. But we have 4 of those. Actually, they're updating right now. So probably in another week, they'll be back up. But we've got the 4. And then we do other types of executive education, and then on our website have other information and background such as video links, and there's a link to the textbook. So when we think about what are the trends, well, number one, we have to step back a little bit, and warning, counterfeiters attend anti-counterfeit conferences. So you're on this call, and with what 89% of you already compliant or with a certification for food safety, including food fraud, you're trying to learn how to be better. Well, you know what? The bad guys are going to also try to learn about what we're doing to try to figure out ways around it. And so we need to understand that. And so more education is even better, because we let the bad guys know we've got a plan where we're coordinating or working together. And that's a key. Next for global trends is, oh no, I'm really hitting you hard today on all the negative side of it, but this is the reality check. The global trend is criminal liability for corporate leaders. And we've seen that over a long period of time, where the C-suite or the board of directors is being held accountable for things. With Sarbanes-Oxley, that started with Enron and Parmalat, there is a focus at that level. And what we see specifically for food companies is health hazards and financial reporting. We in food safety think a lot about the health hazards aspect. That would be the Park Doctrine in U.S. food law, but also financial reporting is a big deal. And that's where with food fraud, it shifts from just a public health threat or those health hazards into financial reporting, because there are laws and regulations that require disclosure or confirming that financial risks are addressed. So it's getting very serious. And I can tell you from talking to CFOs and CEOs, they get this part of it. So to take a quick look at COVID-19, I think no presentation, no discussion, no research at this point forward can be consciously presented without talking about COVID-19. So we'll start that as an update before getting into the process here. So first off, what we see absolutely is massive supply chain disruptions. And anytime there's disruptions, there's changes in that economic aspect of the marketplace and potentially fraud. We see ongoing and future supply chain challenges. So right now, store shelves are being restocked, but all of a sudden you might be buying only one type of bread where you used to buy 4 types of bread. That's putting an immense pressure on specific ingredients in specific production lines. So what we're doing first is, as industry, and you think about this, think back to about mid-March. So for us at Michigan State, about early March is when things really went online and got locked down. The first thing is assurance of supply. So if you're still making bread, you've got to make sure that you've got your ingredients. And it was massive panic in that first month at least. But now there's a bit of a reality, and we're starting to expand out a little bit. But don't forget, the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are still in effect. So even though you're trying to do and focus on number one, getting enough ingredients and products, almost in some cases any way you can, you still got to remember that you're required to provide safe and legal product. And the legal regulatory requirements still include adulterated foods and misbranded foods requirements. I am experiencing a number of companies that have got through that first focus of assurance of supply, and now they're going back to look at their current systems and really realizing that food safety has still got to be implemented. Think about a lot of production lines where people are sick or out or they're changing. Well, is everybody that's working on that production line, have they been trained on that production line? Equipment, have they been cross-trained? Are they properly trained? Do they understand the sampling or testing or food safety issues in addition to other types of personal protective equipment now? And those are all questions that we need to keep looking at. So that's what we'll do with food fraud here, is we'll look a little bit into there, kind of the overall what you need to know and what does a good strategy look like overall and specifically for now. So we'll look at this idea of the food fraud compliance reminder. Now I used to take this out, but then people reminded me that we do need to keep this in just to set the overview and remind us of where we're starting. First off, defining food fraud, it's intentional deception for economic gain using food. Any type of deception using any type of food. And that could be from any type of ingredient coming in to counterfeits or stolen goods in the marketplace. It's all type of fraud to all products. And this is really consistent as a definition around the world. In the US, sometimes you might hear more about economically motivated adulteration, but FDA defines that as just a substance for economic gain, which is just a subset of the overall food fraud. The motivation is economic gain, as I said. A key is that the effect. There's always an economic threat, but there's not always a public health threat. And that's why in the past there's been a different focus, or maybe you might not feel like FDA has a big focus on this. Well, the key is FDA is a public health agency. They prioritize and focus first on public health threat, but it's still, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act defines that as illegal. With industry, we really saw that some of these food fraud incidents led us to understand the intensive vulnerability to the business and to the consumers. And if we take a quality management perspective, then we're looking at eliminating the root causes or possible root causes. There's a lot of types of food fraud. We won't go into them here, but could spend a day on these. Now, something that helps to look at food fraud and the motivation and why and how we need to conduct different activities is to look at the food risk matrix. What we're trying to do is understand the root cause. Now, that makes total sense when we're looking at food safety or food defense even, but mainly food safety is what we think about. But what we don't consider is that with food fraud, we've got an intelligent adversary that's not trying to physically harm us. And so it's fundamentally different. When we were looking at food safety and food defense, we felt like we had pretty clear focus area. But again, it was very different for food fraud because they're actively seeking to avoid detection. Now, when we look at all food risks, we add in food quality because usually these are all managed under that type of system, but also we're looking at the root cause analysis, and those a lot of times start with food quality. On the left side, those actions are unintentional. We do not try to create those acts. On the right, they're intentional by the bad guy. The bad guys know what they did. For food defense, the intent is harm to someone else, public health, economic, or terror. For food fraud, it's economic gain for themselves, and they want to make that money as long as possible. They'd like to make product that's safe so no one ever gets sick and you don't go looking at it. Now, something that's really important to point out right now is about the FSMA and the intentional adulteration rule. The IA rule focuses narrowly on food defense and wide-scale health harms only. So of all the types of food defense that you could focus on, like under GFSI or protecting your company, FDA really focuses only on the public health aspect. Again, that's a part of their mission and their focus. When we looked at the broader terms, this is the first time we've really presented this publicly, and I think it's an important time to talk about it because we're talking about a lot of different concepts. And we actually did a paper with GMA and surveyed their membership, and we looked at all the different terms that were used. And the key is for food fraud specific, this intentional adulteration or intentional deception for economic gain. Food fraud was clearly the most efficient term. Also, with the other terms, they really were including food fraud in it, but it was different in some way or another. This led us to look at and really question, well, how do these terms all interact with each other? A big key is food authenticity with food fraud. So what we did is we took this research and then expanded it into this type of matrix. So the key here that we want to focus on, it's very similar as we saw before with quality, safety, defense, and fraud. But even to look at these terms together within the entire focus, overall it's food integrity, meets all expectations. That could be corporate social responsibility, sustainability, and others. That's all food integrity. Within food fraud, there's two concepts. One is the attribute, which is food authenticity. That's confirmed attribute or identity. And that's then with food defense is in this bigger idea of food protection. And so this is where we see these different terms interacting, specifically food fraud to food authenticity. So what's important about that in those definitions is to then consider what we need to do for compliance. And just to give you a reminder here, again, the most basic emphasis is that food fraud requirements did not go away. Now, your GFSI related audit may be delayed for 6 months, but that doesn't mean that your activities in this area are delayed for 6 months. So it would be completely logical for those auditors or inspectors or your customers to ask historically, what did you do during this time period? Demonstrate your competence in addressing and being concerned with food fraud or bringing on new suppliers. And we go back to the real basics to understand what's needed and when and where. So it's looking at the compliance requirements. And so GFSI was all the way back to January 2018, and they require a vulnerability assessment for all fraud and a food fraud prevention strategy for all food fraud. And the important piece here is that if you have no documents, then that auditor can't confirm that you've got it in place. You get audit nonconformity. And no certificate equals no certification probably means no sales, because there's going to be a real question of if you don't have your food safety certification, whether you could be really an approved supplier. But remember, the FSMA preventive controls rule has required addressing food fraud since 2016. What they basically require is a hazard analysis written regardless of its outcome. And if you're already meeting the GFSI requirements, you're then already meeting FSMA requirements here in general. And it does include introduced for the purposes of economic gain. So FSMA absolutely, positively, 100% covers all types of food fraud and requires an assessment to be compliant. Now, will an FDA inspector or auditor ask you these questions? Well, probably not, unless there is a food fraud incident, and then they will ask. They will ask. Then also to remind you that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, it has not gone away. It's been around since 1938. All types of food fraud are illegal. Remember back, number one is assurance of supply. Number two is to continue to meet the laws and regulations. That's safety and also legal product to sell. Now, something we haven't talked about a lot in the food safety area, but is important for any company that's public, and basically the processes apply to all companies, are Sarbanes-Oxley. So this was a Financial Reporting Act, and that risks to revenue are disclosed or confirmed to be managed. This is a public statement. If you don't believe me, look at Google 10K or 10Q. That's a quarterly or the annual form that public companies must submit to the Securities Exchange Commission. The key there is that companies got together with the associations of managerial accounting and financial to develop practices. So we've got a real good foundation for looking at things that are odd, like product fraud, because all food fraud incidents are bad, but a key question is how bad? Well, we don't need to jump into that yet. We need to go back at this point and look at those most basic concepts. And so we've got our polling question coming up here. So I'll turn that back over.
Great, thanks so much, John. Like you said, we have one more polling question for you here. There's one more after this, but it's regarding webinar topics. Let's go ahead and launch this. This question regards compliance focus. Are you mostly focused on GFSI, maybe FSMA or FD&C Act, legislation in the EU or China maybe, Sarbanes-Oxley, or general ISO 9 quality management or another standard? And I did see a couple questions coming in. Thank you for submitting those. There are a couple of questions regarding slide availability. And like I said before, they will be available from the PJRFSI website after the presentation. Okay, so I'll just leave this poll open for a few more seconds and see if we can get some more votes going. All right, and thank you everyone for participating in these polls. They really do help us tailor the presentation to what everyone is most interested in hearing. All right, and it looks like GFSI is the primary focus of almost everyone, so good to know, followed by FSMA and FD&C Act. So, all right, back over to you, John.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's good to just calibrate to see where people are, and that does feed exactly into what we thought, and so that'll continue to be the emphasis here. Now with GFSI, when these new requirements come out, there's sometimes a question of how much are they really focusing on it. So shortly after the January 2018 is when the GFSI requirement was required. In May, they followed up with this GFSI announcement and this blog post, and then the document, Tackling Food Fraud Through Food Safety Management Systems, or referred to as the GFSI Food Fraud Technical Document. A key here is they emphasize that all aspects of food fraud, the same concepts, are clearly required and will continue to be required. And what those are, to step back, see, it's interesting. So sometimes we get farther along in implementation, and the scope and the goals and the objectives sometimes seem to evolve. So it's good to go back and look at exactly what's required. And this is specifically important for COVID-19 and the issues you've got right now, to go back to figure out what are the real basics that you need to focus on and make sure to cover those. And then we can understand what are the additional activities. So first off, GFSI does not have a lot of base requirements. Now, GFSI sets the requirements, and then those standards, such as SQF, BRC, IFS, and others, they then have to make sure that they address GFSI's for focus areas. So first off, for the vulnerability assessment, there's not much there really, but it's saying the standards that says that SQF shall require the organization. A key with that is it requires your entire company. So if you're supplier quality assurance or you're one plant or one ingredient, that's not what's required. What's required that your entire organization has a documented food fraud vulnerability assessment procedure. The reason why it's important for your whole organization is the Sarbanes-Oxley overall view. The retailers that buy your product, they need all your product to be fine, not just the ingredients, not just part of it. They need all the product. And then documented. Now, it doesn't say very much detail here, and that's where you'd work more with your auditors or your other advisors to figure out how much is enough, as well as for your company. And then you really need to prioritize, and that's a key. So you're assessing it for your entire organization. Again, it's not very detailed, but that it covers all products. Next is the focus on the food fraud mitigation plan. Again, not a lot of detail here. It's 27 words and 31 words. You know, we as academics do things like count that. But again, it's requiring the standards such as SQF shall require the organization, your entire company, have a documented plan. So again, documented, that reviews basically the mitigation plans, prevention for those vulnerabilities you identified in the first step. This is not saying that you have mitigation plans or countermeasures for every single vulnerability in the world. You have them for the ones that are the high risks. Documented is key for both of these because you need to either satisfy an internal auditor or your manager or your CFO or whoever, or an external auditor that you've got processes in place, and that's why it does need to be documented. And finally, GFSI added a third note that they split out to emphasize shall cover the relevant GFSI scope. Now, I think this was split out to make sure that you realize this is all types of fraud. So even if you don't think that stolen goods or whatever is a problem, it covers all those, and it covers all products to the marketplace. Well, now you'd say with COVID-19, if you go back through a vulnerability assessment, there's different things you're worried about, such as PPEs, sanitizer, things like that. Those are MROs, maintenance, repair, and operations products or purchased ingredients, purchased items that you wouldn't have really worried about in the past, but you would now. Real key is that every vulnerability does not need a control plan. You want to identify all those where, again, a year ago you might have identified PPEs and sanitizer, but you wouldn't have worried about that as a vulnerability. This year, if you review your list, those would have popped up. Earlier, maybe species swapping was something you identified but didn't act on, but then all of a sudden with horse meat, your system triggers you to then look at it. Now, one thing you'll notice here, these are very simple. You could just write on a piece of paper. You could write on the back of a napkin, and that could be, quote, documented. And so there's some real questions here that you know, really what you need to know overall is looking at to step back of those requirements to say, what is it that you're really trying to address? So there's a lot of things you could do for the depth and breadth of your activity. When we go back here, we're not going to go into details of everything, but it's the key compliance programs. And I recommend that internally you confirm with your compliance groups which programs they want you to address. In some cases, there's a FSMA PC rule team. Their goal and focus is only to look at the PC rule right now, where your corporation would need to look at broader at the IA rule and all, you know, Sarbanes-Oxley and others, but there may be a narrow focus. That's really important so you don't go too broad, but also you want to be clear to not go too narrow, because you may go through only looking at the PC rule and realizing they want you to focus on GFSI, the GFSI scope. You may be looking at the GFSI scope and not realize that they want you to also look or need you to look at Sarbanes-Oxley or the financial reporting. So a real key when we're looking at the scope and what you need to know is to first identify and get buy-in or sign off on the focus of the scope. Next is then just reviewing that GFSI type list, and there's lists for Sarbanes-Oxley and others, but there's a real challenge that, you know, it's often a criticism. These are just check boxes. You could just do it, put it on the shelf, and be done. And the question is that okay for this stage right now? Yes, absolutely. When we go back and look at things like the beginning of quality management systems, sustainability, remember repetitive stress injuries, that was probably mid-90s, early 90s, you know, carpal tunnel and things, where everybody got the padded hand rests or things for their computers. There was a start, and that was a real key. We're at the very beginning here. So what's important is that the formal and official process has started. So if the auditors, inspectors look at this and just say, we're just going to ask these yes or no questions. Now, that will evolve over time of what those questions are and how deep they are, but a real key is that the process gets started. And we see this time and time again, where there might be this first step at meeting compliance, but they have to create the document for the auditor. You have to create it. You need approvals. And then there's a second cycle where people go back through and say, now, wait a second, let's look at that one again. So a key is an auditor saying, we're going to ask a set of questions and then ask them. That creates the process. If a retailer lets their suppliers know that they will ask these 10 questions, then that gets the cycle moving. And then the question would be, what are those 10 questions? So this has been published on our websites in public, actually published many times, many places. We go through these, and these are just yes or no questions. Now, the key is that you would need to provide documentation to back it up. You can't just say yes, you need to show me. And if you show me, then that becomes an official document. That's a document that could come up in discovery in court. So that's where it gets to be really concerning at a higher level. And that's what we need. We need everybody to focus on these basics and to get a real clear idea of what's expected. Again, think about it, a retailer asking a manufacturer. The first is just ask, have you conducted a vulnerability assessment? Anyone. Is it written? Now, sometimes people have it written, but they're not so confident to show me or whoever. Then that's the same with a creative food fraud prevention strategy. And then is it written? It's got to be documented for someone to be able to look at it and review it. Demonstrate implementation. This has been one of the biggest nonconformities for all food safety systems in the last 2 years. Earlier, it was that people didn't cover all types of fraud, but now demonstrate implementation. So you have a plan, you have a strategy, but so show me meeting agendas, show me meeting notes. Was there a recording secretary? How, think about how you record activity with HACCP or ISO 9000. Those same things should be in place here. Then executive level sign off. A lot of times the executive has seen it, but hasn't officially signed it. That's where there's a statement that this represents something that's competent for our company. And then we've seen an expansion of some of the concepts, as is logical over time. Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review. A lot of people look at different products as problems come up, but haven't done a holistic review as a year comes around again. And then next, to demonstrate if you have a method to review your incidents and general market incidents. Usually this is a very informal process, which is natural to start, but it really should get more formalized. And then the two that were the big stumbling blocks for most people in the past were first addresses all type of food fraud. A lot of companies did not address counterfeits or stolen goods, and then all products. Again, it's from incoming goods all the way through to the consumer, finished goods to consumer. The bottom line, when that retailer buys your product, or if you're a manufacturer, when you buy an ingredient, you need that product to be usable and safe. And if there's a global recall because of counterfeits or something like that, that could disrupt the marketplace. So this is a gap analysis. So as we say, what does a good strategy look like? The first step right now is to go back and do that gap analysis, to ask these 10 questions. If you can say yes to all 10 of these and you have documentation, then hey, good for you. But now you have something to review. You have something to document, to review again on an ongoing basis. Once you do the gap analysis, we see a next step is to really organizing the programs into a strategy. And what we see most often is that there's a lot of programs that popped up due to as a response to one problem or another. Maybe it was melamine, so you test for melamine. Then it was horse meat, you test for horse. Well, if you're in South Africa, why don't you test for zebra also? Now, if you're in the Netherlands, you wouldn't test for zebra, but you test for something else. So all these programs popped up for one issue. Now it's really good to put it together as a comprehensive strategy, because what you do when you look for melamine or horse meat, that's information that could come together and help you in your overall reduction of your fraud opportunity. That's the first step of looking at that strategy. And then before looking at how to look at the plan and really take your steps again, is to go back and look at the base requirements. So first off, GFSI requirements are very clear: documented vulnerability assessment and then documented prevention strategy. So from that, why not first have a one-page summary? Why not have a one-page summary? Number one, it helps you consolidate everything you've got, but also that may be enough to convince an inspector or an auditor, a boss, a compliance manager that you've got a plan in place and it's followed. And if you look here, things like this corporate risk map, even at arm's length looking at the screen, you don't know what it says, but it shows that there's some level of rigor and process to put this together. It gives some level of confidence. And then second requirement is a food fraud prevention strategy. And again, why not have a one-page summary? Make it easy for everybody. Now, we're not trying to get away with anything. We're just trying to make it synthesized, consolidated. And right here, we call this the food fraud prevention cycle. It's a management system. It's a way that different activities operate. So with both of these, that would demonstrate at a very high level that you've got these processes in place. Again, we're trying to look at the first step in updating your plan and making sure you've got the thorough plan in place. We also recommend two other documents. One is a single-page summary document on your food fraud policy. This demonstrates where internally you have authority to deal with this, how it fits in, what groups are supposed to be managing it. And on the right is your food fraud audit results. This is a requirement for IFS, but we also think it's pretty good to do for yourself or to share with auditors as well. If anything, it's gathering the history of what happened before, because I can't remember what I did yesterday sometimes, let alone a week ago, a month ago, a year ago. But you really want to have down there the details of what the audit said and how you responded to it. And usually it will have a lot of detail of how you did advance the work processes in place, how you overcame an audit nonconformity. And then finally, before the call to action, when we're looking at what does a good strategy look like, really a good strategy looks like what is effective for you and what is calibrated to your unique fraud opportunity and your unique risk tolerance. So you put those plans together. We've looked through to see what the basic requirements for GFSI are. We've looked at a basic set of gap analysis, 10 questions to get you started to see where you might have gaps. We looked at what the output might look like, those 2 one-page documents. Now, one of our other research articles was how to put together that step. Now, if you haven't done this before, this series of activities for implementation, it's a great set of steps, but also this is great for an annual review or update. First off, convene a task force or a group. Assign a group to look at this. And it really should be an executive that sets a scope and sets a deadline for this, a requirement for the deliverable. Then create this enterprise-wide food fraud mission policy statement and begin drafting the plan. Now, again, if you've done this already last year, this is a great time to review that overall policy and mission to see if it still meets your needs. To think about how maybe COVID-19 and the supply chain disruptions have changed the way you're operating. Maybe you're bringing on twice as many suppliers as you used to bring on in a month. Maybe you have different audit requirements for them. That then can be challenged or reviewed against your own policy. Maybe you need some changes. Then look at initial screening, a real quick high-level pass at this. So, anything with the changing of suppliers, more volume from suppliers, different products from suppliers, you can look at a very, very high level at that. It's key to look at a high level in light to start because you need to look at everything. You need to figure out of all the products you buy, which ones should you focus on. Once you identify questions or concerns, then you go into a deeper vulnerability assessment. And these can be extremely comprehensive or they can still be pretty light, but these would be those top 10 ingredients or some top 10 problems you identify. This is still within the task force review. Then you plot these and you review these vulnerabilities on an enterprise risk map and plot them. So you might have identified 25 new vulnerabilities, but that doesn't mean you have 25 new control plans. This would then be looking at prioritizing which ones you need to focus on. And then consider countermeasures and control systems for those very high vulnerabilities. Why it's important to look at that at this point in the process is that, let's say with COVID-19, you're now looking at personal protective equipment and sanitizer. Well, you never looked at that before. And a question might be, well, how would we analyze that? Maybe there's a different type of test you need to measure the concentration of a sanitizer. You might not have that test method or that equipment in your lab. So if you realize that that's one of your top concerns, then in your proposal and your review here would be identify the gap that you don't have the necessary equipment or training or education to test that product that is now a major concern. Then when you put the plan together and you propose your food fraud prevention strategy, you now have some fidelity or detail on how the plan is working right now and what you might need to have as a change. This is a great document to also demonstrate implementation because it shows that you've got a task force working on it and you're constantly looking at it. So really my call to action here and recommendation, this is something, this was really the same before COVID-19. It's just become more important now to look at the basics and to be more thorough, is to first conduct that gap analysis. It's basically those 10 questions. To just go through there and then you've got a external type review of where you are. Next, review the most basic compliance requirements. We did that to look at GFSI specifically, and that's back to the GFSI requirements in GFSI. You then would look at your food safety management system in detail. Go back, I bet it's been 3 years maybe since you actually read it, almost cover to cover, but go look at the food fraud requirements specifically. Figure exactly the minimum of what you need, and then you can build upon that. Identify the key compliance programs to define your scope. Again, is it GFSI? Is it FSMA Preventive Controls Rule? Is it Sarbanes-Oxley? Is it all of them? That helps you scope your activities. And finally, seek common training and guidance. Start with trusted partners. There's a lot of information out there. Do not reinvent the wheel. Please do not reinvent the wheel. There's so much information out there. Go look first to see what's going on. Ask your suppliers. Ask your customers if they have programs, if they have plans. Find out what they're doing and share best practices. The basic processes themselves are not competitive. They're not proprietary, not competitive. And that really helps to have a consolidated approach and really harmonized focus on the best practices. So with that, I'm really happy to take discussion, and I've kind of fed you a glass of water with a fire hose, but really want to just be here for any questions that you have.
Great, thanks so much, John. I love the fire hose analogy, just saying. One last polling question for everybody before we move on to the Q&A. We do just want to ask, what webinars would you like to see from PJRFSI? We've been pushing a lot out in the past couple of months, with everyone being stuck at home. We really want to give you those online options for, further education and other informational purposes, So if you want to select as many as you want, if you just want one topic, go ahead and choose whatever you would like to see from us, and we will do our best to get those on our schedule. Now, just to reiterate, we will try to get to as many questions as we can. I know we're running pretty long on time here, but we're going to try and squeeze in a bunch of questions after this poll. So go ahead and drop those questions you might have into the questions tab of the control panel. All right, and thank you all for your input. It looks like a lot of people want a lot of stuff. So Paul, do you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about our upcoming webinars?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to. So again, thank you very much for taking the time, John, on the call today. It was very, very good and informative. I actually enjoyed every part of it. So just to give you a bit of an update, we have a couple more webinars that are currently scheduled and coming up this month. The first one is on next Tuesday, actually. It's May the 29th. It's with Jacqueline Southey from FSSC, the scheme owner under GFSI. We're going to be talking all about updates to their standards, a little bit more actually around the integration of the standards. When I talked earlier about we're not quite there yet, Jacqueline and her team are actually doing quite a bit on this front to integrate the standards such as quality and environmental into the food program. So that'll be a good one. Then we are May 27th, we have another webinar with Primus GFS. They are another certification scheme under GFSI, and we're going to be talking a little bit about how they as a scheme owner are managing the risks and whatnot around COVID, and talk about what they're doing and what they've put in place. So this will be very important to anybody who is currently Primus GFS certified. Yeah, so that's it. Just stay tuned to our channel, and we look forward to welcoming you on future ones.
Great. All right. And it's the time you've all been waiting for. We would love to answer some of these questions that have come in. So let me go ahead and scroll through our list. Let's see what we've got. Let's see. All right, we've got a question here from Mary. Mary asks, per slide 29 regarding hazard analysis, does our company's hazard analysis need to address food fraud, or can it be handled like a prerequisite program?
That's a great question. A key is that, to separate that, there's a lot of things there. One is a prerequisite program. So that is a HACCP term. So a key is that addressing food fraud is not addressed in HACCP. It's separate. Now, food fraud could be a root cause of some food safety incidents, but overall, from the GFSI type compliance, it's outside of the HACCP plan. So you have to do a separate food fraud vulnerability assessment. That doesn't mean that it's going to be as big or detailed as your HACCP program. In fact, it's going to be easier if you do just a food fraud assessment. So yes, you've got to do it outside of that, but also then GFSI emphasizes that the food safety, food fraud, and food defense assessments all fit in and integrate into the food safety management system. So that information does flow in as you've moved it out. Hopefully I addressed that question. Maybe I went around in circles on that.
All right, we've got a question from, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce anyone's names, it's not my strongest subject. We have a question from Rajesh. He asks, have food fraud incidents gone up during COVID-19? If so, under which commodities has it gone up the most?
Well, that's a great question. One thing we absolutely positively know 100% sure, the fraud opportunity has increased because we've got supply chain disruptions. We've got more product moving. We've got less. We don't have audits going on right now. So the fraud opportunity went up. Now it's going to be very difficult for anybody to say with any statistical level of significance that food fraud has gone up yet, because a lot of times we have a delay in the awareness of when fraud occurs or the number of incidents. Now, I think over time you'll see news alerts and different types of reports of food fraud evolving and continuing to happen. So it's really difficult to say that about how quantitatively we can say that it's gone up. Now, one thing that also happens is that there's a flashlight effect that has happened in things like looking at counterfeit products. Is that if border patrols or Customs and Border are concerned about a specific type of product, let's say that there's a problem with watches, and the watches coming in have batteries that are faulty and they're catching on fire, then Customs may take a focus and look at watches for the next month. And let me tell you what will happen. If they look at watches for counterfeits and fraudulent watches, they're going to find more because they're looking more for it. So we have to make sure to balance all these factors when we're trying to make a statement. Now, again, if we look at the vulnerability of your company and your product, the vulnerability, the opportunities in the marketplace have definitely gone up. What you need to always do is first do an assessment. Look at the likelihood and consequence, because that's the bottom line. There might be more fraud, but it might be smaller scale. Maybe there's some activities that you do that lead fraudsters to not attack your company at all. So there could be fraud out in the marketplace completely, but maybe it doesn't affect your company. So the fraud opportunity absolutely has gone up and changed, but you really need to go back and look at that assessment and do that yourself.
All right, great. We've got a pretty lengthy question with an example here from Derek. Derek asks, how would you determine possible food fraud if you are, for example, a third-party logistics warehouse who does not own the products, have ingredient lists, or even open the outer cases of the product? I've had facilities hit on BRC audits for not doing enough to prevent food fraud with our inbound product inspections looking for damaged, tampered, or open cases.
Well, I think you actually answered your own question there. Well, back to what I said before too, is that first off is to look at the requirements, and GFSI has actually some new requirements for third-party logistics suppliers, people that don't open the product at all. And so that's first to go back and look at GFSI specifically. But a key is you have to conduct a vulnerability assessment. Now, with you, all of a sudden, then to say we don't open the product, we don't touch it, then the likelihood and consequence, the likelihood that something could occur would be very low. You do an analysis and state that, but you just identified 3 factors, 3 incidents that do occur. And so one thing you could look at is then to say, do we have a system to monitor if the product gets opened and resealed in our facility? Do we have a program for destruction of damaged goods? And right there, then those are probably things you have anyway under your quality programs, and then in that case you would just adapt your quality programs. So for third-party logistics or anybody, packaging as well, is to step back, look at your operations, and go back specifically to the compliance requirements and see what's required. And you'll find a lot of guidance as well from, well, even things like you can bring that question up for Jacqueline with FSSC, and you've got a lot of resources, but start with the basics and then build from there.
All right, great. We have a question from Lois. Lois asks if you have any examples of applying food fraud to packaging in terms of bottles.
Yes. So I said the third-party logistics and added packaging there too. So with the same situation occurs is that the first step is to look at what is the compliance requirement. So if you have again FSSC coming in for a food safety audit, then look at the FSSC requirements for packaging for food safety. Also go one step back to GFSI and to see what they state in their packaging guidelines. Then the key is that you still have to conduct a hazard analysis or a vulnerability assessment. So you basically look at your operations and try to see where fraud might occur. Now, if you're making the product and it's put in clean boxes, right, and shipped directly to the candy maker right across town, there's a very low fraud opportunity, very low likelihood that something could occur. And there's also low consequence if some type of fraud occurs. So you have to just look at your system and to see where there might be system weaknesses. Think about like a food safety audit. One of the things I remember is that with some type of food bottles is there wasn't a hood over the conveyor belt. So once the product came out sterile from a blow molder and went into the box, that there was a chance for dust or things like that to fall in, and so that's where they identified one of those weaknesses. So that's the way to start. Start very simple with the most basics, and then look at the vulnerability, and then address it.
All right, thank you. We've got a question from Alice that looks like it should be geared towards Paul. Alice says, we're a food processor, with suppliers in 30 countries, and we need to implement a program for not only our supply chain, but our food fraud in other areas as well. Where should we start?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot that you probably want to take into consideration when you're building or developing out a program for your suppliers. A lot of organizations will simply implement a GFSI program as a minimum requirement. However, there's a lot of organizations that would just simply never get to a GFSI level, so you need to have a backup plan, such as a first or a second party program. What I'd recommend is when we get to the part of the presentation with our contact details, feel free to just reach out to me directly. We should be able to support that. Currently, we have auditors in about 60 countries around the world that are doing these types of assessments. So please reach out to me directly, and I'd be more than happy to help.
Thanks, Paul. And yeah, as Paul mentioned, all the contact information on the screen right now. If you have questions that are sensitive or specific that you don't necessarily want to ask publicly, please do feel free to reach out and ask those questions, and we would love to help you out. Let's see, we've got a question here from Matt. Matt asks if you have any suggestions for maintaining chain of custody verification for material received LTL.
Paul, you want that one? Is that?
Could you just repeat that one more time, please?
Sure. He was asking for any tips on verification of custody on supplies LTL.
That's a good question too. What are your thoughts on that one, John?
Yeah. Well, the key is I didn't know if there might have been some of from the registrar side of that. The key is that you look at it's a challenge, but you look at the document. Start with going back. It sounds so basic, but go back to the requirements. Go back and look at traceability. So there are specific traceability requirements in GFSI and in the food safety management systems. Start with that as the base, and to see what's required there, and then compare that to what you're actually doing. So you're probably, I would guess, already compliant with those. So you may already be 80% of the way there or all the way there. And then you internally have a reference point to go to compliance and say, we believe we're compliant because here's what it said, here's the 3 types of requirements, and here's what we're doing. Now, the other side of that is another entity that would be concerned is your customer. So I would then go back to the basics to look at what's required, GFSI, FSSC, write it up internally, and then if you have a concern, to present that to the customer to say, hey, here's what we're doing. We just want to make sure that we're addressing this in the way that you're looking to do it. And then at that point, then they're either going to be okay with it, most likely, but they may have some other guidance or best practices. And then you now have those basics from the GFSI, FSSC, and then from the customer. Now you can go to compliance and identify and review whether you whether you've met that or not. It's very different with different types of products. You know, if you've got diamonds that you're moving around the world, or things that are you know, a corporate social responsibility statement, that's very different than if you've got just a commodity conventional product.
All right, we've got another question from Rajesh. Rajesh asks, how could I handle a non-GFSI supplier who's unwilling to share full audit reports and provides only the certificate? The supplier in this instance is a low-risk chemical and packaging supplier, not a primary packaging supplier.
Well, one thing you've done there is you've already done an assessment. You know, you've looked at that. Well, you've done an informal one anyway. And so to think about the likelihood and consequence of that being a problem. Now, if there is a requirement, I mean, if it's required of you that let's say it's a requirement of you that all your suppliers are GFSI compliant, or you have to report it or something, then the key is you can only trust as far back as you can trust. And so if they can't give you documentation to say that to confirm and state that they're meeting food safety requirements, then you can't trust it. It's not got a food safety certification. So you would then have to have some program in place to review that product to make sure that then you authorize it, or you approve it, that it meets your standards. Now in that case, then you from a corporate compliance standpoint, you may have requirements on you may now have say it's the chemicals, cleaning chemicals, sanitizers or whatever. You may have requirements that say that if they are GFSI compliant, they go through this process. If they're not GFSI compliant, there's other costs, other tests that need to be conducted before that product's approved to be used in your plant. At that point, then that supplier can decide if they want to keep selling to you or not. You know, and if you buy from them, you may have to spend $100 on a test before you even use their product. Well, that goes into your total cost of ownership, and you may stop buying from them. Nothing encourages compliance more than a lack of a sale. And sometimes you have to pull that. That shows that you're really serious.
All right, great. It looks like we've got a question from Pinky. Pinky would like to know, what are the 10 questions for gap assessments?
Yeah, those would be up on that previous slide, the food fraud compliance requirements scope. And so those are just the 10 yes or no questions. Those are our questions. They're the most basics. You know, I've seen that you know, so yeah, there we go. And that's a great starting point. Very, very simple. And so go through those. Now, sometimes you need to get a little bit more detail. And if you are, say, FSSC required, then you would go through and look at specifically the section that in FSSC where they cover food fraud, and then you would look at each question, each item specifically, and then, you know, create a table or something where you can say yes or no, we meet it, and here's a link to the documentation that supports our statement that we do meet it.
All right, excellent. And if it's helpful to you, Pinky, these slides will be available from the PJRFSI website. So if you wanted to reference, you can download those after the presentation is over. We've got a question now from, and apologies again for my pronunciation issues, Antrix has a question. What are the HACCP and CCPs that should be implemented across the supply chain during, including e-commerce?
Wow. So that is so the critical control points to see what activities, what countermeasures or control systems you would need to have in place. That's how I perceive the question. That's deciding, you know, what type of faucet you want to put in your house, in your bathroom, and you haven't even built your house yet. So if it's in the kitchen or if it's in a bathroom, then you need a different type of faucet. You really need to go back to you have to do a vulnerability assessment first, and that then identifies, you know, the likelihood and consequence of problems. It identifies which problem you have. At that point, then it defines where there is a system weakness and what occurs there. And at that point, you can now judge a countermeasure or control system. An example is, think about horse meat. So if you were a retailer that sold lasagna, you made lasagna and sold it, then you could think you could test for horse a lot of places. But if you really looked at the supply chain, the most efficient place to identify that product is when you receive the meat itself. Not, I mean, if you try to test lasagna for species of the meat, that's pretty challenging because you got so many ingredients in there. Also, meat is a small percentage of that overall product. But if you've got 50-pound blocks of meat, that's where you could test it. Now, most likely you're buying from just a few meat suppliers, so you could then test each of those companies as you receive product and possibly have it be a condition for release, most likely not, but you just test that product when you receive it, again, the whole meat. So in that case then, specifically for horse meat, would be looking at the critical control point would be the biggest system weakness combined with where you could test for it would be upon receiving. Now, when you say how much, what test should you conduct, sampling method, frequency, that depends on the likelihood and consequence. If you buy from 4 suppliers that are all, quote, tier 1 suppliers, trusted suppliers, strategic, in business, the same people, then your fraud opportunity is lower, because if you do find a problem with them, the consequence would be very high for them. If you happen to buy off Craigslist or some guy on the street or from brokers completely, brokers that you don't know, then the fraud opportunity would be higher because they may have less of a awareness of your needs, or they may have just a higher fraud opportunity, lower chance of getting caught.
All right, great. I know we're running a little bit long here, but one last quick question from Jim. Jim would like to know if there is a sample plan that might be available to reference.
No. The key is it's back to, like, think about that horse meat example. Is it generally you have to understand the situation and your specific fraud opportunity and your specific risk tolerance, what's exactly happening with incidents. At that point, then you could, well, let's say that example I used where you're a retailer, you make your own lasagna and you're buying the meat. So now if you do identify, again, let's say that you do buy from some unknown suppliers, and at that point where you receive the meat, at that point, a great first step would be to go to the companies that do the species testing, the equipment companies or the laboratories, and then ask them about what they've seen in that space for the specific type of tests. Sometimes you don't have to do a very complex test. If it's something like if it's sand in or some type of filler, sand in ground black pepper, a microscope. You could use a microscope to look for quality control for fraud, as long as you know what you're looking for. You don't need to have an NMIR or do mass spec on that. And so it's really at that point to identify the real specifics of the problem and then look at the possible solutions there. A key is you're not trying to catch food fraud, you're trying to prevent it from occurring in the first place. And if you do just the detail of looking and finding those system weaknesses and just look a little bit at that weakness, the flashlight effect, put your flashlight on it, then it's going to have a deterrent effect to start.
All right, great. Thanks so much. If anybody had any other questions or comments, concerns, anything that we didn't get to today, I'm sorry again, go ahead and send those over to Paul or John, and I'm sure we'd love to get you some answers. But since we are running a little bit long here on the session, I'm going to just say if there's any parting words of wisdom from either Paul or John, any thoughts?
I just say, work with great partners like PJR. They're people that you're engaged with. They see a lot in the marketplace. They can really help guide you. So that's my main recommendation.
Thanks, John. And just on behalf of PJRFSI, thanks everyone for your time today. I know that everyone is very busy and dealing with a lot, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance today and your time. If you wanted to review the slides or the recording, those should be up on the PJRFSI website in the next couple of days. So please go and check those out if you have a chance. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our mailing list to get all the updates. And I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy and sane out there in these difficult times. And I hope you all have a great rest of the week. Thank you so much.